Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 14 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
And this is the 100th episode that we've ever done of this podcast. This is the 100th episode. We just passed 2 years since we first started doing it earlier this week, or I guess last week when this comes out. So 2 years, 100 episodes. A lot of podcast episodes. Lots of hours of us talking on the internet.
With no one listening.
Yeah, pretty much. No, we have some listeners, so a small selection of listeners. But we are doing a T-shirt giveaway. We talked about this at the end of the last episode, but we've gone ahead and designed some T-shirts. I've looked over sort of the rules surrounding reviews of podcasts and things like that, and I think we are in the clear. I don't think it's against any policy codes or anything to incentivize reviews as long as it's not like money. So our T-shirt competition, we've designed a T-shirt, has our logo on it, Unlimited Opinions, Seasons 3 and 4, like on the left pocket on the front. And on the back, it's got a big picture of Joseph Campbell's face. Of course, the great comparative mythologist has a quote from him about what a hero really is. You can find that on Twitter, as well as more specific rules for entering the competition at ULMTD Opinions. I'll put out a tweet with all the information about that. It'll probably already be up by the time this podcast
So what are the
comes
rules?
Out. Well, the competition is the most.
You're just doing this. It seems like, because I didn't have anything to do with the design other than to say okay, and I guess I'm buying them.
Yes. You're the money behind this.
Yes.
Yeah. The competition is whoever can leave us the most interesting review on any podcast platform.
Any platform.
To any platform that hosts podcasts. To make sure that we see it. Make sure you DM us to kind of claim your review, because of course your name won't be in the review. So DM us on Twitter.
Well, it could be in the review.
Well, I guess it could be. But DM us on Twitter, or you can email us. I think our email is unlimitedopinionspodcast@gmail. Just where your review is at, what's in your review. I'll be looking around at Apple Podcasts, Podcast Republic, a couple other places that do have the ability to review podcasts anyway. But to make sure we see it and to make sure you claim your submission, DM us on Twitter or email us, and we will enter you into the running. We'll see if we get even one review from this.
But it doesn't have to be positive.
No, it's the most interesting. We're not even incentivizing good reviews. We're not bribing anybody.
Right.
Just give us the most interesting review, completely subjectively decided by us. There's no rubric. There's no guidelines for what is the most interesting. It is just decided by us, which I think is a good measurement.
Yes.
Yes.
And speaking of T-shirts, I'm wearing a Truman State University T-shirt because we have another big event.
We do.
I'll have my first speaking engagement. My next one pays double what this one does.
So still zero.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Wait.
So 0 times yes. That's great. Yes. He's an opening speaker for a more, I don't want to say, I guess a more important speaker, more known speaker.
No, more important
speaker, yes.
Yeah. But notable.
So that's besides the point. We should get into the topic for today, which is John Locke and the Revolution. Of course, a very great liberal philosopher, political theorist, I guess you can say, kind of set about some of the first descriptions of more liberal, consent-based political theory as a whole.
We're talking about classical liberals.
Yes, classical
as opposed
liberals.
to the progressive communists that we have now.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that. And we start off with the Glorious Revolution, and kind of the story of Locke's life. He was born in 1632 as the son of a Puritan lawyer who sent him to Westminster School and then to Christ Church, Oxford. Locke was under suspicion during the Restoration, as his early views about religion and political authority were authoritarian, and he may well have been expelled as being too eager to support the Commonwealth. And this is a big change throughout his life. He was very authoritarian in the beginning. He pursued an advanced degree in medicine, giving him an anti-rationalist view, kind of the idea that one cannot understand the world from first principles outside of experience. The way that we understand everything, we have to experience it. He says human reason is a divine instrument that enables us to know as much about the workings of the world as we need to live sensibly. So very big on human reason. Medicine brought Locke into contact with the Earl of Shaftesbury, as he saved him from a potentially fatal abscess on the liver. And then Shaftesbury converted Locke into a liberal figure. And Locke initially believed that a ruler was entitled to make whatever religious dispositions he chose and things indifferent, but Shaftesbury believed in religious toleration and the right to religious liberty, and so kind of put these views upon Locke. So Locke became Shaftesbury's confidential secretary and followed him into opposition against King Charles II. And as conflict grew in the 1670s and 80s, Shaftesbury drew on Locke for political advice against the king. And the opponents of the king rightly suspected Charles was trying to betray his kingdom to a foreign power. The secret Treaty of Dover of 1672 said that when the time was right, Charles would return his country to the Catholic faith, and the French king Louis XIV would march his armies into England. And so his opponents promoted an exclusion bill of Charles' Catholic heir in 1679, and a full-scale crisis ensued with Charles not calling a parliament for 5 years, and Locke fell under surveillance from royalist spies in Oxford, and so remained very quiet during those years. And when the plot to assassinate Charles in 1683 was revealed, Locke fled to Holland, as he was somewhat tangentially related to the plot. One of the creators of the plot was a frequent correspondent of his. And so James II, the heir of Charles, then became king and tried to establish the conditions for a French invasion, but ultimately failed as the country was heading for civil war, and James later fled to France in the late 1680s. And so Locke returned to England, leading a quiet life and being made Secretary of the Board of Trade, and later being known as a philosopher, the interpreter of Newton to the wider world, and a defender of religious toleration, and then died in 1704. So he led a very interesting life. Lots of different positions, lots of different events happened during John Locke's life. You're looking at me with a strange look upon your face.
That was an excellent summary.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it.
It's jarring when you read history, like there would be an English king that would sign a treaty that would basically be a treasonous plot for the French king to come in and invade the country.
Yeah, it's not just like almost treason. It's like just actual treason. Right. Like he would just let the French king come over and take over the country in order to restore it to Catholicism.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. But then currently people think that Trump was a Russian agent, and I think there's a lot of people that are Chinese agents high in our government. So I guess it's not as unusual as it kind of it was when I was first reading it. I thought, wow, I'm not really.
I mean, it's the most overt thing I've ever seen of this sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
But very interesting life of John Locke. And then we get into his political writings. And there's a few that are very important. The two treatises, I guess. Treatises. Yeah. The two treatises on government are the most important. The first treatise is a long demolition of the views of Sir Robert Filmer, the author of Patriarcha, which the defenders of Charles II used as a propaganda weapon, as it argued that authority of kings is authority of the fathers handed down from Adam, so essentially tracing any monarch's authority back to Adam and his control over his family.
Yeah, I found the discussion of that boring, or kind of like inconsequential. Kind of like he was in a political spat with some temporary. Almost like two columnists were writing columns. I wasn't really interested in that.
Yeah, but Sir Robert Filmer thought that the will of a monarch is absolute, arbitrary, and unbequeathable, and Locke spent several hundred pages assaulting this. So he spent a lot of time and effort assaulting this, and he kind of explains a little bit later that the reason for that, it seems ridiculous to us now, but it was very popular at the time. Like, it was a really effective tool for them.
It was influential.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because it basically said, maybe we can skip that section later, although you probably have like 5 pages of notes. But that, the Bible says that God endowed Adam as a dominion over all living creatures, and the king is essentially a direct descendant of that over his dominion, however limited from the kingdom, and so do as you're told.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I could just cover my notes on that right now. I don't have too much else to say. But essentially the argument that Locke thought of was like, well, Adam didn't have ultimate power over everything. He had, stewardship powers was essentially what it was. He didn't have complete authority to do whatever he wanted. And B, monarchs are not descended from Adam. Like, that is just such a stretch to say, well, we inherited this power, and it's just complete nonsense as such. And those were his two arguments to essentially take down this whole line of thinking.
Because really, we're all descendants of Adam.
Yes.
So what gives him the dominion as opposed to me? And also, it does you mentioned the stewardship. It's very much like the Lord of the Rings with the stewards of the Gondor.
Yes.
Trying to usurp, the real authority of the king, or the people, and then he ends up dousing himself in gasoline or whatever it was, and jumping off that was in the movie. Yes. Was that in the book too?
He burned himself. He did not jump because, in this is, Lord of the Rings, backstory here. But the place where he burns himself is like nestled in the mountains behind the palace. So like the movie kind of makes it look like he's in the palace area and he just runs off of the big mountain spike. But it's really a really long path to get back to like the cemetery and the where they keep all of their dead.
Yeah, it makes sense. He wouldn't have the cemetery in the palace.
So if he was actually burning, there was no way he would have survived that very long run. But it makes for a very cool shot.
Or it would have been pretty easy to put him out, I guess.
Yeah.
If he's, I think I'm burning a little bit as he starts heading towards the great precipice.
Yes, the great precipice.
By the time he gets there, that he's fully engulfed.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
It would take him about an hour.
Yes. But that's going back. Thank you for the breakdown of Denethor's burning. That's great.
Denethor. Yes,
Denethor. That was his name.
The guy's name.
Yes. Back to the book.
Which might have been the best actor in that movie.
Really, you think so?
He was just so repulsive.
Mm-hmm.
Don't you think?
Yeah, he did very well.
Job.
Did very well. But back to the book. We were talking about Robert Filmer, not Fillmore.
Filmer.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. Let's skip over.
Yeah. Skip over him.
It was interesting, but I don't think it was. It wasn't like nobody studies Locke to get into his disagreements with Filmer.
Yeah. Exactly. But then we move on to the second treatise, which advances from premises about the human condition to conclusions about the nature of legitimate government and defends a moderate constitutional government. And it was seen as astonishing and dangerous at the time as it told citizens that in extremis they may have to act against the anointed authority. And so that's why everybody got very angry at Locke at the time, or all the royalists got very angry at Locke.
And I guess it's because we grew up in America that this just seems like so vanilla to me. But, when you think, when you study the time and how revolutionary it was, that we all have a certain natural right over our own person and property and really our heart and our mind.
Yeah.
That we have to consent to be governed, and that the ruler has really a conditional authority. It's really revolutionary at the time. But it's just, for me, it's just like, yes, reading it, yes, he's right.
Well, that's a good point to make. He mentions it several times briefly throughout here, but Locke was, of course, hugely influential on the American Revolution. Things like that, and I'm sure we'll get more on the influences when we actually cover the American Revolution, but this is definitely, I think, one of the most foundational things that inspired the American Revolution, or inspired the values set forth in the American Revolution.
Well, I think that there's a good mix between Hobbes and Locke. Hobbes about the state of nature being difficult and brutal, and that you need to have a limited government to kind of keep everybody at bay, and then Locke is more of an optimist about human nature, it seems like.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later, but that was my thoughts.
Sorry,
thoughts
I
exactly.
thought this was the podcast, but go ahead. Well, we'll follow your format.
All right.
Yeah, knock yourself out.
Yes, there's one other important political writing, and that was Locke's essay concerning human understanding, which set out to establish the throne and the consent of the people. It's another big part of Locke's theories. It implied that the Parliament had chosen William III after the Glorious Revolution to sort of lead them, and it raised the question of whether a people that had given sovereign authority could take it back, and where consent lies, which has been a question that's come up several times within the last few episodes. But Locke was very big on consent of the governed. All right, now we get into the second treatise. Unless you have anything else you'd like to
No, I don't want to step on your toes here.
Okay.
You have a schedule. We'll go along with your with your outline.
Well, we have to explain the things before we talk about
Fair
it.
enough.
That's all.
Right, let's go to the next step.
Well, the second treatise begins from the premise that men are born free and equal, neither possessing authority over anyone nor owing allegiance to anyone else. And Locke,
true. Don't you think that's true?
I do think that is true. Absolutely true. And Locke aimed to have his readers think about ordinary facts of life in a new light, because there would be very few people who would say, well, no, that's wrong. But I mean, there were arguments against it. But to just think about these basic things, just in a new way.
Yeah, and it's like at the time, people were borderline slaves. I mean, you might have some property, you might have employment or some income, but it was your freedom is very restricted back then by monarchy, and historically it was unheard of to think of. Well, I was born. There's a difference between the practical side of it, the way it exists, and the way it really, what your rights really are. It's just that the government or others are impinging or infringing upon your rights.
Yeah,
and that is a revolutionary idea, and it's true.
Yes. Yes, because he says political arrangements are artifices constructed by human beings for human purposes. There's
Right.
no like inherent divine thing about them. We construct them for our own purposes.
Correct.
And the rights and duties that these political arrangements bring must be justified. Why do you have this power? Why do you have these duties? And why do we have these rights? What is the basis behind all of this?
Yeah, and if they can't justify it, then you need to throw them away.
Yes, exactly. And he says, God alone possesses absolute and arbitrary power. For an earthly government to claim this power is blasphemy, which I really like. I think that's a good point that he puts out here. If you're claiming to have power over all of these people, are you not making yourself a god?
Right.
I think that's exactly spot on.
And I think that particular theme needs to be expounded upon in public with regard to our governmental officials more and more, because they are claiming some sort of divine right or divine knowledge, omniscience about, especially I'm on a COVID rant now because
I figured this is where this is going.
But yeah, you can feel it going that way because it's you have to do what you're told. You have to rely on the experts, and we know, and they don't know. They never knew, and if they knew anything, they lied about it.
Yeah,
it's crazy. But I think calling it blasphemy is exactly what it is. And of course they'll say, I can't be blasphemous because I'm an atheist. Atheists can still blaspheme. They just don't
know they're
believe they're blasphemous.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no,
anointing themselves gods over us.
It's a definite problem.
Little jerks.
He also says here that Locke produces religious reasons for a secularist and anti-absolutist idea of politics. So he's not, saying, religion isn't important. He's still saying religion is very important, and that's
foundational.
Yes, and that's why we need an a-religious government, which is interesting. It's an interesting argument. I don't think anybody's ever said that before, which is fascinating.
It's a great argument, and it's so true. You have to have this religious base for his theory of natural rights, which I'm sure we'll get to in just a second.
We will. He also says here that the government is by the consent of people, and that the purpose and nature of political society here, I'm going to read from the book, political power then I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties for the regulating and preserving of property, and employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws in the defense of the commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good.
Yes.
It exists, he says, to secure men's property, by which he means their lives, liberties, and estates.
Yeah, he has a broad definition of property, and I have that quote underlined as well. I mean, the quote from Locke there in the book is great.
Yeah.
And he's talking about property, not just the stuff you have, not just the money in your wallet. He viewed property as more broadly based about you and your interests in different things too, your freedom.
And that's what he says political authority is. Political power is the right or the use of use and control and preservation of those properties for the pursuit of the common good. That's essentially what political power is or should be.
Right. But even if you have it limited, I think having property rights over your stuff is foundational for freedom too. And I don't think people really appreciate that either. That is, if the government can take everything, all your stuff away from you, you have nothing, no individual freedom, because they can control your entire life.
I just realized I also never said what book we're reading, because I was talking about yes, we were reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book describing the history of political theory from Herodotus to the modern day. There we go. Should have said that at the beginning, but I was distracted by the t-shirt.
Yes, you're so excited.
I'm so excited. We're going to get so many reviews. Yeah.
Well, it's in the notes. It's
that is true. That is true.
It's in the season description.
That is true. That is true.
Description. So I don't think it was a surprise to anybody. What we're doing.
No. I think if people have been listening to 100 episodes by now, they know what we're doing.
I doubt anyone has listened to all 100 episodes. Do you think anybody has?
Oh, I think so.
Really? You know one?
I do know one at the very least, and I'm sure she's listening right now, and she's listened to every single episode.
Oh my gosh.
And I apologize to her.
As you should.
Just listen to all of this. He also says that a person without rights has nothing of his own and is therefore a slave. He says an absolute and arbitrary authority is inconsistent with the essence of political authority. To take that absolute authority is to remove the purpose of political authority. It's to enable the people to use their rights, to use what they have, and to claim authority over everything that they have is ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense with the idea of political authority. He also denies that the government has any concerns with the spiritual powers. The property is our external goods, security against attack, ability to make a living, freedom of movement, etc., but not a concern with our immortal souls. That is not something that the government should have.
And that always makes me uncomfortable. When it used to be more prominent on the right wing or the Republican side of it. It was before your time. So like in the 80s, there were a lot of almost like televangelist type politicians that always talked about how the politics has to be inspired by. I mean, I don't mind being inspired by God, but that we're ruled by these things. We also see it now on the left-wing side, the incessant moralizing about different policy preferences. And I think that's really my biggest, I mean, not biggest, but it is the biggest reason why I have the heebie-jeebies about Mike Pence. Mike Pence just gives me the heebie-jeebies. And I don't know what it is. I just have a kind of a visceral negative reaction to the guy. He's always talking about God, and he's so... I think falsely earnest, but I can't really say that because I don't know the guy, but he gives off this weird quasi-religious thing, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's a weird line you have to walk because I think the government should, I don't know if promote virtuous lives, but allow people to live virtuous lives. Yes, but I don't think, but the government should not have the power to say what is religious or say that we are acting because this is religious, because I feel like that just gives them too much power to say this is moral and this is immoral.
Well, for them to declare it officially, I would agree. I mean, I don't mind talking about morality and virtue. I just don't. I don't like that. There seems to be no humility or acknowledgement. Hey, I may be wrong, but this is what I think is the virtuous path, and this is what I think is the best policy to encourage the best behavior among everybody. And I don't mind even talking about politicians talking about sin, but when they get too close to religion, because you don't have to have it Bible based, you don't have to, and you don't have to be so certain that it is God's path. You could still advocate for it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I know what you
mean. It's the certainty that I have more of a problem with.
Because I feel like that gets back into the blasphemy thing. Like it's like I know what either God wants or what religion wants in this scope. I know for a fact that this is what is necessary as required by God or whatever have you.
And I think it's also off-putting because there's so much overlap in virtuous and belief about virtues between all of these different religions. I think. Well, like you're seeing an alliance between just regular run-of-the-mill family members and the right-wing Christian zealots and the Muslims, especially in Michigan. We have a significant Muslim population where they're talking about the left-wing indoctrination in schools.
Interesting,
because because like in Dearborn, in a couple of areas, there's a huge Muslim population. And they're up in arms because they got this, rainbow coalition talking about things that in other countries you get you killed.
Yeah.
Like in Qatar or Qatar or whatever you want to call it, where you can't wear a rainbow hat to the FIFA match.
Yeah.
They're going crazy about it. But there's a lot of overlap with some of the basics of moral behavior that cross all religions, as far as
this is something I saw
promoting promiscuity in children. It's just, I think every religion says that's wrong. Whether you're, no, I don't think there's a single religion that believes promoting sexual activity among children is okay.
Yeah.
How is that been taught in our elementary schools?
Yeah.
And so I think if you articulate that way, where you're not saying, well, the Bible says this or that. If you just articulate the values of it and the morality of it, I think you get a lot more people going along with you.
Yeah, because that was something I saw. I'm not sure where I saw it, who said it, but it was like somebody was saying, I've always wondered why the right has never been just the religious side. He's like, I don't understand how like all the Muslims and the Jewish population have been, left-leaning for so long. Right. It's like, the right should work to incorporate, all religious people because there is that commonality between everyone, and the left is increasingly getting away from that religious, backing, I think.
Well, I think you make tremendous inroads in the Muslim community. The Jewish community is a little bit different because there is a Jewish philosophy that is very left-wing and very liberal. And then there's the conservative Jewish faith or the Orthodox faith that I think they're predominantly Republican, but I think I haven't studied the subject, in detail, but I think they're a distinct minority of what you consider the Jewish population.
Yeah.
And their numbers that are practicing are declining, of course, with the law,
all religions,
all religions. But yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. But I think there's really more of a broad-based thing, because even if you're non-practicing, just kind of generally believe in God and people should do the right thing, you could really appeal to those people in value-based terms without getting super religious. And so, but I think getting back to the subject matter, I think Locke would agree with that to a certain degree. His philosophy is that the government shouldn't have anything to do with the management of a religion.
Yeah, that's what he says here. That's my next note here. He says, our inner lives and spiritual allegiances must be protected from the coercive interference of the state as they are the most important. Because they are so important, they should not be in the hands of the government.
Correct.
That should be as far from the government as possible, essentially. He says, we require the protection of our rights to form voluntary associations to meet and worship according to our own best judgment, but no more than that. So essentially just the ability for us to meet and worship, but the government shouldn't do any more than protect that.
Right.
He says, we are born into a world already under law, and that is natural law, which we'll discuss more in detail. But he says, reason says that we are made by one almighty creator, sent into the world about his business, and we can infer from there what our natural rights and duties are. But he says that there is certainly natural law, but not all are in agreement about what it dictates. And he kind of says, there's a quote here, men are everywhere met with, not only a select few and those in a private station, but whole nations, in whom no sense of law, no moral rectitude can be observed. Hence, among these nations, thefts are lawful and commendable, and the greedy hands of robbers are not debarred from violence and injury by any shackles of conscience. For others, there is no disgrace and debauchery, and while in one place there are no temples or altars of the gods, in another they are found spattered with human blood. So he says, we all understand that there's some sort of natural law here, but what exactly it is, we can't seem to agree on. I think,
yeah, I've always struggled with that. I don't know what your thoughts are on natural law. I've always believed in it.
Yes.
But it's hard to articulate the limits of it. What is part of the natural foundation of foundational laws? Like I know it's in the Constitution, but I mean beyond the Constitution. What are those laws, and what's the logical basis for it?
Yeah. Well, I think that almost gets back to last season in a way, to tie things back into Joseph Campbell and, comparative mythology, which t-shirt competition, check us out on Twitter for details there. Yes. But like the idea that, humans naturally have a tendency to create similar stories and to value similar things. Yeah. And it's like, if we look at all of these across the board, there must be something there that's either, it's all true and we've all, experienced it to be true, or there's a natural inclination for us to want these things. Right. And so it's like, it's the question of, do we come to these things because there's an external truth in them, or is there like an internal desire to just want these things? It's kind of that question there. But I think it is hard to narrow down, but I think, there is definitely something there that we all agree with.
Now, Locke has an easier time of it than most, because he says, well, just God created it. Yeah. And so he has a very religious foundation for it. But in order to sell it in contemporary American society, it's harder because so few people are religious, and almost nobody accepts the Bible as an authority. And well,
that's kind of going back to what we were just talking about maybe the right, being the religious party, just saying, we all accept, every religion ever accepts that the world was created by a god or some gods, and that therefore there is a purpose for everything. And that is where we are deriving, what we value in our rights and everything like that. Yeah. It comes from that same spot, and that just differs from the left, or what the left has come to be, which is just the a-religious, completely atheist, is there any meaning at all, sort of deal.
And I'm gonna not want to jump ahead too much again, but I do find it funny how much Locke hates the atheists.
Yeah, that's
I
he
believe
hates
in
the
toleration
atheists.
for everybody, but those damn atheists. but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it logically. I'm not advocating anything, but his argument in part is that with a religious basis, you have an understanding that there is a God, and he set down moral laws, and you have to follow certain moral laws. With an atheist, you don't have that foundational requirement, and so an atheist can never be trusted. Essentially, is his argument, which is pretty interesting. But having known atheists, they can't be trustworthy and decent people, and so that raises other questions about morality. How do you judge people? And whether you should judge people and all that.
Exactly. But now we move into discussion of natural law itself, going into more detail about his thoughts. He says, law is law because it is the command of a superior. He says, to believe natural law is strictly law requires God as a lawgiver, but does not require belief in any particular religion. So if
do you think that's true, though? I don't know.
About what part of it?
That it's from God. And you have to have a belief in God for it to be true. You know what I'm saying? For it to be real or to be enforceable, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't disagree with them. But how do you sell this to people that are not religious and don't believe in God?
I mean, I guess it goes back to the idea of, do you have to ask them, okay, do you agree that everyone has a right to life or a right to liberty, to happiness, whatever,
Not those Nazis.
That's
those
true.
MAGA Nazis. Yeah. That's a problem we're running into. How do you get back to the foundational discussion? I think, I know in my mind and my, soul or my heart, I guess I should say, what I believe natural law to be. Certain things that exist, whether you have government or not. It's it's like whether it's right or wrong with nobody's looking.
Yeah.
Those type of things. But I don't know, absent a religious belief, which I have. How do I articulate that morality other than in utilitarian terms, which I really don't like?
Yeah.
It's
well, I mean, you just have to ask. Okay, is it? If you're in the woods, nobody's around, nobody will see you, and you have another person with you, but he has all the food, do you kill him? And it's like, do you think it's wrong to kill him? And I think the vast majority of people would say, well, yes, it's still wrong to kill him. It's wrong to murder. Okay, why?
Right.
If you don't have a belief in God, where does that law come from? You have to accept that there's some sort of value in humanity, in life, and that there is some sort of value in our actions. There's some merit, some judge of what is right and what is wrong. Right. And then I think you just have to work backwards. How do we know that? Yeah. Where does that come from? And it's like, I don't know if there is another answer besides God, really. Yeah. Because I don't think, I guess the evolutionary argument is like, well, that's just, a natural urge that we've developed because it's, beneficial for people to not kill each other. Right. Which I guess makes sense to a certain degree, but it's like,
yeah, there's a school of thought of atheists that they have a moral philosophy. They just don't have a foundation in God or religion. That it's logic. That there's a certain logic to acting in a moral way that's not purely utilitarian. It's more emotional, kind of spiritual, kind of non-God, kind of like we're all part of the same cosmos type argument. But which brings up, I saw a little clip of an old Reagan clip. I'm going to mention.
Okay.
So he said, I want to take out, I want to invite over, I guess I should say, a bunch of atheists for dinner, and I want to have the nicest dinner they've ever had. The best food, the best wine, the best everything, and at the end of that, the best meal they've ever had, I want to ask them, do you believe there's a cook? Because they look around at this world, this beautiful, organized, scientific world that runs, such a complex creation, and they think there's not a cook. So
interesting. That is an interesting way of looking at it.
He said it a lot better than I did. Yeah. But
that's great.
I kind of giggled about it. I saw that today.
No, that's funny.
I giggled at a little clip about Reagan.
Yes. But going back to John Locke, he says, we are intended to use our gifts, satisfy our lawful appetites, and flourish. And so we are sent into the world to secure our own long-term good and promote the good of everyone else. And that's essentially the aim of humanity. That is why we were put here. God created us. This is the purpose. And like you said, a man who does not believe in God cannot regard himself obliged or bound to behave decently, and so atheists have no claim to the toleration extended to all deists. Yeah. He also says that Locke held a very Aristotelian view of the way that morality and self-interest are joined. He says we are social creatures, and we flourish when other people's well-being is an important part of our own. So sort of a practical look at, why we want other people to succeed. We ourselves succeed when others do. It says, however, he did not believe that all men that what all men thought was the best part of an ethical truth. Kind of the Aristotelian idea. If the majority of people agree, then this must be the truth. He says, no, that's not the case. It's not just a majority decision on what is ethically true. He also disagrees with Aristotle in believing that work is beneficial. Aristotle thought, the best life one can lead is complete leisure, but he says, no, work is beneficial. God has given us skills, talents, and resources, and so we should use them for the improvement of the human condition.
Yes.
Because we have all this access to everything, we should be doing something with it.
Yes, and I think that's very, very true.
Yes.
I'm on Locke's side on that one.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for people to do nothing a lot of the time. At least certain people.
Kidding
Well,
me? Have you met people? Have you met people? Have you been out in the world? There's an entire swath of Americans that can do nothing.
That is true.
Day after day after day.
I guess what I should say,
month after month, year after year, until they die fat and miserable. And they will squeal like stuck pigs if you take away their benefits and all that. That's the only time they actually get active, is if you take away any of their entitlements.
What I meant to say, I think it is hard for a person who believes that their life has meaning to do nothing, right?
No one whose life has meaning is doing nothing.
Yes.
Anybody who has a meaningful life has an active and giving life, period.
Yes.
There's nobody that has a meaningful life that acts either selfishly or doesn't act at all. That is absolutely true.
That's more of what I meant. Somebody who's trying to live their best life would have a hard time just doing nothing.
Correct.
That's what I think.
But I think very few people,
Yes.
and I struggle with it, actually devote themselves to having a meaningful life.
Yeah.
To put yourself out there and to create and to do good things, or just to work,
Yeah.
Be productive.
And then at the end of this section on natural law, he raises the question that I think we've kind of been talking about too, which, how this framework, operates with the modern death of God. He says our liberal democracies now eroding because they've been founded on this, idea of natural law and God-given rights. If we take God out of the picture, if we take this divine part out of it,
yes,
can they still exist?
And the answer is going to be no, long term. I don't think there's any way. And I think, and he talks about, well, you can have it as a foundation of basically a logical society, that even if you don't believe in God as the foundation, of the natural law, it's logical to go the next step to say there's certain foundational rights. It's in the Constitution. It's in our, what do you call it, a European or the European,
I don't know,
Convention on Human Rights. And I think that's all well and good, but really what it comes down to, though, is people need to have a belief system, a faith system. And they're going to have one way or the other. If they don't believe in God, they're going to have a different faith system. And you're seeing now where like we have in our Constitution a freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But really, you see a tide kind of trying to overcome that individual right and being against the First Amendment, being against free exercise of religion. You saw that during the COVID lockdowns where they were shutting down churches involuntarily because this health issue is so much more important than your soul.
Yeah,
and they have a faith, and so when you don't have God in there, you have to. The belief systems are more important than logic. So nobody is going to. Very few people, I should say, will guide their decision making and their public policy decisions based upon logic as opposed to their belief system or faith. And I think if without the God in the equation, or without a belief system that has moral underpinnings, this Lockean system that we have in the United States with individual rights that have to be protected and preserved by the government as opposed to granted by the government is not going to last over the long haul. We're seeing some problems with it.
Yeah. Because I think any society needs that moral framework, like you're saying. There needs to be an agreed upon set of rules, essentially set of values, set of virtues.
Values.
The rules
yes. come from the values.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Right.
Yes, I was using yes.
Right.
But this idea that they are the most important thing, and when those in societies when these things are agreed upon, that these are based on God, no matter what, even if you do have that logical approach, like, well, there's still good things even if God exists. I think no matter what, it is that slippery slope. It's like, well, once you say, well, God's not real, then it's like, okay, but we founded this on this idea that, these are God-given rights. If God didn't give them to us, then why are they rights at all?
Right.
It's like that will inevitably happen because you've opened up that door. And it's an inevitable slope to, these aren't rights at all.
Well, and it, I guess I'm not, I don't have a problem with them, having it as a logical foundation. I'm just saying that it's just not as strong as a belief system or a faith system.
Yes.
And if you don't have, and if you don't have that foundation, it's just, the whole thing is just on a foundation of sand, and it's going to shift and it's going to collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. We then move
and
on.
We're seeing that. I think
Yes.
we're seeing a lot of it in modern society in the last 30 years, and I think it either has to have a restoration, not necessarily religion, but of the values, the common shared values, or we're going to see a further disintegration of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. We then move on to this peaceful state of nature, which I think is one of the few points that I think we'd both really disagree with Locke here to an extent. Some points,
yeah.
yes. He says that we should not harm another in his life, liberty, or possessions unless our existence depends on it. Talking about, when we are in the state of nature, when there is no government. But he says, but our lives do not depend on it very often, and so the state of nature is typically peaceful. So kind of counter to Hobbes's idea that, we inherently, our lives are always at risk, or we believe them to be at risk, and that's where this warful state of nature, this very unpeaceful state of nature kind of arises from. Locke says, well, our lives would not usually be at risk, so state of nature typically peaceful.
And I'm kind of, like I said earlier, I think there's a blend that is true.
Yes.
I think you can end in a Hobbesian state of nature depending on who's around you, who's in, because you're always going to have some sort of community. You're not going to just be a man or a woman alone in the woods.
Yeah.
You're going to have other humans around you. But when you I think they even mentioned explorer and the Native Americans trading in the wilds of America at this time.
Yeah.
When he's writing this, they were in the state of nature in a sense, because it's just two people that are exchanging.
Yeah, there's no shared government between them.
There's no government, or no government, in some areas, and so I can think practically, in my practice, which is I have a number of rural clients, and if you drive out to some areas, you may not be met by the owner carrying a shotgun, but they'll probably have a pistol, and it may or may not be concealed, because if they're not expecting you. If they're expecting you, of course, and they know you're coming or whatever, but and that's not necessarily threatening. That's why I don't think they'd be coming out with a shotgun to certainly be available, but there's a certain state of nature, and people can get along. But if a person wanders up and asks for help, they're going to give them help.
Yeah.
Or if they are aware of people nearby that need help, then they act as a community. And there's such a limited government in those areas. There's almost no local government. There's almost no local services. For somebody that lives in a very rural area, and they tend to be very peaceful areas. Their per capita violence rate or murder rate is going to be pretty low. And so I tend to agree with some of it, but it can devolve very quickly, and you're really at a mercy of an armed band, and that's where it becomes Hobbesian, where it's just everybody against everybody, and it can really degenerate. So I think I agree with Locke in some respects. We don't need to have government involved in everything in order to have exchanges and interactions. We don't need it. Generally, but there are times we do need it, because the Hobbes theory that we're all against each other, is competing interests.
Because I agree with that. We do that, Blake. Because I think Hobbes's idea is right to an extent. And I think that's almost what you were describing by coming out with a gun, because Hobbes believed we're all essentially very distrustful of each other, and then that's what inherently leads to violence. Preemptive striking, essentially, because I think you're going to come attack me. So I don't necessarily agree with Locke's, inherently peaceful unless our lives are in danger. I think we are inherently distrustworthy, but there can still be peace in that. You don't think so?
I don't know. I think well, of course, I'm not going to come out pointing the shotgun.
Yes.
It's just, it's not even really a warning. It's just, who is this person, and if they need help, I'll help them out or whatever. Just I'm not here helpless.
Yes. Yes.
So, and I'm not saying that it's going to happen every time, but in certain areas it might. But I don't know. I'm wrestling with it.
Yeah, I think it's a middle ground between the two for sure. No matter what.
That's what I think. Yeah.
We then get into his discussion of when a state is created, rulers do not acquire any rights that do not already exist in the law of nature. And this is an interesting part that I really like. He says we cannot give our rulers powers that we don't already possess. So essentially, this kind of goes back to the impossibility of having an absolute arbitrary government. We don't have absolute power anyway in the state of nature. We cannot give that to anybody. And he says, essentially, because we no one has absolute and arbitrary power over their life, liberty, and possessions, and especially not over anyone else's life, liberty, and possessions, we cannot give that to an absolute monarchy. It's a moral impossibility. Like, it cannot happen. That is just a fact of nature. True. Which I really like. He also says that we have a right and duty to punish breaches of the law of nature. He says government solves the problems of motivation, judgment, and organizations. In the state of nature, we are obligated to punish these breaches of the law of nature, but government smooths out the process. That's one of the benefits of government, because when we're in the state of nature, it's like, well, what's my motivation for punishing you? How organized is it? How fair is it? And government helps smooth out that process. This provides for a known and settled law with impartial judges, and the right to punish is the right to prevent the exploitation of our individual rights by another. And so essentially that's where we get this idea of punishment. It comes from this idea that it's just protecting the exploitation of individuals. It's not inherently a right to just power over everybody else.
Right. And there's some, I think the author is a little critical of the theory, that there's a right of punishment that exists separate from government. Yeah. But there absolutely is. And in fact, until recently, most of the deterrence and the punishment for crimes was societal. It's not just a 3-year stint in prison that can destroy your life. It's also, after you get out, nobody wants anything to do with you. Depending on what
to be employed.
If you're a convicted child molester, it's not just going to jail for a period of time, not just the conviction. It's that you're almost like branded, with electronically branded, really, because it's public record. And it's very similar to the old scarlet letters, for adulterers, and that's really, and so if you're talking about natural law, there's going to be a certain level of punishment that everybody has the right to do, and he mentions that you may be more likely, if you have an individual right to punishment, you may be more harsh than if you're punishing for something somebody did to somebody else. And I don't know that that's true. I mean, it's certainly not been true in my experience, my 10 years as a prosecutor. The vast majority of victims and victims' families would have been much more lenient when they were personally involved than they would be with other people. There's a lot more people than I appreciated that are more merciful.
Interesting.
When it applies to them, more forgiving, but they'll be more judgmental in the abstract. Like, they know you should get a huge punishment for killing somebody, but they are willing to forgive for killing a loved one of theirs.
Fascinating.
And a lot of it has religious overtones. You see that really strong in the African American community. Where the forgive somebody. I mean, there was one that was a murder case, and the mother forgave this guy for killing her son.
Wow.
I was completely surprised by that. No, she didn't want him to go free.
Yes, of course.
But I don't. It depends on the group of people, or really the individual. But I think a lot of us are more in favor of punishment when it's not personal. Although there's obviously a tendency for retribution if you're personally involved, because the emotion and all that. But as cooler heads prevail, people tend to be more merciful, especially like theft or burglaries. People would tell me, well, I don't want this person's life to get destroyed just over, some stolen stuff I can replace. Yeah. I'm like, what, are you kidding me? I'm going to stick it to that guy. He's going to prison. But and they're like, well, you can do what you got to do. But they want to, and part of it is they want to, there's always a tendency to try to absolve yourself of the moral responsibility for it too. So there's a lot of that going on. Yeah. And they're like, well, if you think that's the right thing to do, then, go right ahead. But I just want to make sure that it's like, okay.
Yeah. Makes sense.
We now move clear. I'll take on that burden.
We now move into property itself. It says property to Locke is not just our possessions that we may transfer to another person. Locke bundled this idea. Our possessions are part of our property, of course, but he bundled this with our legal and political personality into our propriety. That is essentially all of what our property is. It's not just what we have, but it's also who we are legally and politically. He says that which gives us a stake in the world and a political system. So essentially what gives us the ability to participate in the world, that is all of our property.
Right.
So all of our rights are property, but there are restrictions on what we can do with them. He says here on page 471, if I can find where I put it, he says, we possess a property in our own persons that excludes any other human being from claiming ownership of us. We are born free and equal. We could not be born free and equal if someone else could claim to own us. So kind of this idea, again, against absolute authority, but, this idea that, in a way, we are not absolute and outright owners of ourselves. The only being that owns us is God, which I think is an interesting idea. He says that we are entitled only to make of ourselves the creatures that God intends. So therefore, there's no right to misuse or abuse what God has given us, and therefore suicide and prostitution, things like that, would therefore not be a legitimate use of resources given to us.
Yeah, and that's a really strong argument against a lot of these self-destructive behaviors that just don't have any power or influence over the present day generation, the younger generation. It's like, but the whole argument though that your body is a gift from God doesn't ring true, and once you believe that it's just something just to use like a video game or something like that, then you kind of it opens up a Pandora's box of dysfunctional behaviors.
Because Locke founds it on the idea we cannot own another person, so why can we own every single thing that we can do with ourselves? Essentially, there's a higher owner, and we're entitled just to use it properly. There's a specific.
We have a leasehold interest in our life and our body, and it's important. But if you're abusing yourself, you're committing a sin.
Yes,
and people don't get that concept today. I want to go back to one last thing on the punishment issue, because of course I'm always interested in punishment thoughts.
Yes, of course.
It talks about punishment, and the government has to. There's an argument that only the government can punish others for something that's happened. That you're not a personal victim of, because what's the philosophy behind that? It's not your stuff. You're not involved. But there's a societal interest in that, which I just talked about. But like this whole defund the police thing is really. It doesn't mean people aren't going to get punished. It's just an invitation to vigilantism. Yeah. Because and that's what's happening in the retaliatory shootings and murders in high crime areas. Because nobody's going to report it to the police. They're just going to take care of it themselves. And you see unsolved murder after unsolved. It used to be really uncommon to have unsolved murders.
Really?
Back 30, 40 years ago. Now, in some areas. It's over 50%. Over 50% of murders are unsolved. Now, there are suspects, and then the cases are closed because the suspects get murdered, and then that's an unsolved murder. Yeah. And then you have the suspect in that murder is an unsolved murder. So, if you don't have effective punishment as a society, you're still going to have punishments from individuals, and it's going to be worse, and a lot more mistakes happen. Interesting. And so I just want to mention that too, because it's not like there's not an individual or collective. I think there's a natural right. I think that's one of the things that we have to have as part of a society is the right to punish wrongdoers reasonably for violations of individual property rights or other individual rights that are like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all that. So there has to be a punishment of it, or else it's just then it becomes Hobbesian.
Yes, anyway. I agree. It then moves into constructing legitimate government. How do we actually do this? He says, men are in a state of nature when they have no common government. He says, sovereign states are always in a state of nature in respect to one another because there's no higher governing body. Essentially, Germany and United States are in the state of nature towards each other. He says individuals are in the state of nature if they encounter each other in a place with no common government, like what you were saying earlier in the American wilderness.
Right.
He says the state of nature is a social state in a condition governed by laws of nature. And he says human beings could, in principle, live together under generally accepted and morally binding rules without government. So, like what you were saying earlier, there's really no inherent need for government. Government just helps along the processes that we already have via natural law.
Correct.
In a way.
Yep.
And that's when we get into a long discussion of ownership, which I thought was very interesting. And this is what prompted people to label, some critics label Locke as like a capitalist revolutionary, something like that. Right. But it's interesting. He says, in the state of nature, it is possible to acquire legitimate property rights over external objects, actual physical things that we own. He says, but without government, it raises the question of, wouldn't we have to ask the whole world to take from the common stock? In the state of nature, who owns what? How do we claim ownership of things without asking permission from everybody?
Well, let's just be clear at the outset. The only people that really criticize this theory are communists.
Yes.
Because if Locke is persuasive, their entire philosophy is BS from the beginning through the middle and through the end.
Yes.
Because because his theory of property and individual right to own property is foundationally destructive of communism. Because if you have that right, communism is immoral, unjust, and impractical, and an abomination before God. And I wish our current Pope would realize that. But anyway, go ahead.
Yes. But to kind of go into this, he makes a distinction between positive and negative community. He says positive community, joint ownership over everything. Each owner must give consent for part of property to be alienated. Sort of this idea of essentially, a communist idea that everything belongs to everybody. And then you have negative ownership, where nobody really owns any particular portion of the world, and any unowned part may be used without infringing anyone's rights. And he kind of leans on this more than the positive community when talking about the state of nature. There's no real inherent ownership until we have some things in place first. He says God's donation of the world is available for the use of all, but mankind has a collective interest in its being properly used, and misuse is a violation of everyone else's property in the world. So again, going back to God, this is all given to us by God. We have to use it in the right way. To misuse it is wrong, is somewhat of a sin, essentially. He says we can individually and without permission from others acquire our own property by mixing it with what is inescapably our own, and that is our labor. So by adding our labor, nobody can take our labor from us. That is one thing that is, very much restricted to us. If we mix it with something in the outside world, it becomes ours. He says labor is defined by any activity by which we make a productive difference to the world. And he says that there are 3 tests for legitimate ownership. It is acquired by labor, and that enough is enough, and as good is left for everyone else after you take what is yours, and what we take is used and not wasted. And so if all 3 of those are met, then it is legitimately yours. He says, but if another has a need to what is mine, then they have a right to it, and it is theirs. He says, a starving person has a right to my grain, essentially going back to that idea of, if I have so much and nobody has enough to live, then they do have a right to it. He says, however, one who can labor but is unwilling to has no claim to assistance from anyone else. He says, if you do have the ability to add your labor to something and then rightfully claim ownership, then you have no rightful claim to my stuff. He says that there's a complication. The complication of ownership and an economy prompts the need for government. He says, this all can exist in the state of nature, but as it gets more complicated, as we add money, as we add different forms of economy, then we need government to sort of regulate all of these processes. He also goes into this interesting discussion of land ownership, and this is kind of where we get into the communist idea.
Right.
He says land ownership is lawful and that landowners benefit the common good. He says here on 479, he says, a crucial thought is that in making land fruitful by my efforts, I do not diminish the common stock, but add to it. And therefore he that encloses land and has a greater plenty of the conveniences of life from 10 acres than he could have from 100 left to nature may truly be said to give 90 acres to mankind. So this idea that if you own this land, you are producing something. If it was just left to nature, it would not be producing things. But by owning it and by having people work on it, it is contributing to the common good overall.
Yeah, and I don't know if I find when he gets into to this level of detail about almost the morality or the God-given right to have property. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I agree with the sentiment, and I think it's logical. And but it's hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard to make a moral case for the appropriation for limited resources. Mm-hmm. For who gets what. It's hard to have a moral case for it as opposed to a practical case. And especially like with this argument about land. Well, if you have these big landowners and there's only so much land, and like right now, pretty much every square foot of the state of Missouri has some sort of legal owner of it. Maybe the state or federal government, which has very big swaths, or local government. But there's going to be a legal description and a plat for every county, every piece of land in the state. So in order for me to get more land other than this little house we have here, I'd have to get it from somebody. I'd have to transfer it to me, and maybe that's not fair. And I think that there's something to that discussion of, okay, what is the moral basis for somebody to own the land?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so, well, you have to productively use it. Well, we don't really believe that, because there are absentee land owners that have 100 acres of forested property out in Reynolds County, and nobody knows about it. And I don't know if I can go this far where it's there's God-given rights. I just know that practically speaking, the property ownership by individuals that can't be taken without just compensation is the only practical way to do it. And you look at different examples throughout history, where people toy with socialism or communism. Like I read a book recently about overthrow of Allende, if I'm even pronouncing his name right, in Chile. Well, he had and his predecessor instituted a plan of, they had huge landowners that really it was a real corrupt system. They, a lot of people didn't have any property and they're destitute. And so they had this appropriation where they would break up big landowners and they'd give it to smaller people to manage. It was completely inefficient, and their production of food dropped precipitously. And so that the inflation was shooting through the roof. I mean, we think it's bad now, and then it was like 100 and something percent annually, and they just didn't have enough food to feed people. And so I think the practical arguments about capitalism and property ownership are better than morality. Saying, well, the God has said that we all have the right to property. I mean, I don't know that God is dividing up this stuff.
Well, he acknowledges that. He says the difficulty does arise when all the readily cultivated land has been acquired. He says landowners then must employ those without land on decent terms. But then that creates the question:
what? Or then what? Who decides what's productive use? And I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
well, and then he kind of goes into the argument against communism because he's like, well, they're adding their labor to the land. Why does it not become theirs? And he says that these laborers do not then become landowners because we have a right not to acquire material things, but to acquire a living. And so if they're
why don't I have that right? I don't I think Locke does have a weakness there. As a moral argument as opposed to a practical. I think he's absolutely right on the practical side of it. But saying that it's God's rules or part of natural law, I don't know
it's shaky. I think the idea is because it's already been owned by somebody else. And so just by adding your labor to something that is owned by somebody else does not make it yours. That is to take away their property rights because they got there first, essentially, I think is the argument.
Well, what if they just inherited it?
Yeah, well, that's the other issue. I think he does struggle with inheritance too, because he kind of dismisses it. I think a little bit. He says, because there's nothing at this time that is, essentially, consistent enough or strong enough to last for generations. So naturally, it would go to somebody else. But
right, I mean, the true answer is it's impractical because if my dad had this property and he left it to me, he wanted me to have it. Go F yourself because you're not coming onto my property.
Yeah.
I mean that's the practical because otherwise it would be mayhem, and you have to have he's right that you have to have property rights as a foundation of a constitutional republic. I mean you just can't have a functioning government without individual property rights over the long term. It'll just turn into despotism. But I don't know that it's a gift from God, and you can go from generation to generation to generation because you will see an aggregation of wealth among a family because it's natural that you want your kids you want to work hard, and as you get closer to death, you're wondering, why am I trying to get all this stuff? And you realize, all my kids and my grandkids will be able to benefit from this, so I'm still going to work hard, and I still want to expand this so that they can benefit from it.
Yeah, because I think I don't know if. Because I think it does struggle if you're claiming like this property right comes directly from God. Because I think what you really have to do is you have to argue it comes from other things that are given from God. Like the argument essentially that we have a God-given right to care for our children or our offspring. Right. And that's where we get sort of the idea of inheritance. Not necessarily that inheritance is a right given to us from God, if that makes sense. Right. But there are justifications for inheritance through our other rights given by God.
Well, I think really, I guess it's more of a legal argument that, once you acquire the property, you have the right to transfer the ownership of that property to another person, and that transfer can include leaving it in inheritance.
Yes.
Essentially, the legal structure.
Yes.
And so, but it's hard to talk about the labor used to improve the property not being, if you're saying that the moral justification for continued ownership is dependent upon your productive use of it. That's tough.
Yeah.
because then wait a second, because not only do I have the right, I only have the right to transfer it to somebody else, but what if they don't use it productively? I mean, that's a tough quandary, I guess.
Yeah,
it was.
it is.
Yep.
He then goes on to talk about money briefly. He says the creation of money is important, and money is anything will serve as money if it is a store of value and has a means of circulation of commodities. He says money is accepted by convention, not instituted by nature, and with money, money is important because with it, a developed economy becomes possible. All of the other things that we like in modern society, loans and all of the other things that enable us to kind of move forward in an economy become possible through the creation of money. He also says that there could be legitimate forms of slavery. He says that...
Of course he does.
Of course he does, 'cause everybody says that. He says those taken in a just war can be made slaves, as they could lawfully have been killed, and slavery is the lesser of the two evils.
Yeah, what are you complaining about, slave?
Yeah, I could have stabbed you back on the battlefield. Now I own you. That's better. But he says, however, the manhunting of that current time is not lawful. Of course, the slave trade in Africa and the United States, or what was going to be the United States, he says the slave traders of the 17th century were not acting lawfully. That's not a just war. You cannot claim that hunting down people is part of a just war in any sort of way.
It's pretty. It's always fascinating to me to see those kind of disparities between being such a revolutionary thinker on one hand, but then and slavery was so ubiquitous through human history that up to this point that you shouldn't expect them to get it right. That slavery is just wrong in all its forms, but it's still kind of jarring when he's making
talking about all these natural rights, and then he's like, well, sometimes slaves can be acceptable
as long as they conquer them.
He then moves into a discussion of setting up the state, and I'm going to read just this opening here because it's a very concise definition of what exactly he defines as the state. He says, so we come to the creation of government. Its role is obvious, to provide a known and settled law administered by impartial judges. The brevity of this list is deliberate. It is no part of government's tasks to save our souls, to establish a church, or to take sides in moral controversy. Its authority is limited by the needs of its subjects, the protection of their rights, and the clarification of their duties to each other. The argument is overdetermined. God grants us only the powers we need to fulfill his purposes. If he requires government to attend only to our earthly needs, no government has absolute and arbitrary authority. It is a contradiction of the very idea of government. So very, very limited government. This is what government does. It protects our rights and enables us to work with each other. That's essentially what government does. This is the purposes of government. He also says that even where authority must be absolute to be effective, it is never arbitrary. Even where we do have, massive amounts of power, they do have to have a reason. They have to be bounded by their purpose. You have to say why I need this power. And I think that's something that's been forgotten a little bit recently. I don't mean to bring up COVID again, but, the emergency powers that have continued on for months.
Still in place.
In California? In Biden?
Biden's extended the emergency declaration of the federal government.
Really?
Yeah.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah.
That is absurd.
It is absurd. It's absurd, and they ought to impeach him for it. And the Senate should convict. I mean, it's just a complete usurpation of legitimate authority for no good reason. Zero good reason.
Absolutely.
And for it to go on this long, it's just insanity.
Yeah. He says any person or institution may claim only the rights needed to fulfill their functions, and the sanctity of the individual person bars governments from invading rights except where defense of others require it. And so that's where we get this idea of limited government. You could only infringe upon my rights if I'm endangering somebody else. That's essentially the only way you can ever, enter into my rights.
Right.
He says that there's a two-stage process to institute government. The first part is that a people constitutes itself a people by a contract of all with all. So this is still within the state of nature. We haven't set up a government, but we realize that we are a people. We've come together with some sort of underpinning of moral, natural law in a way. And then secondly, the people put themselves under a government of a specific form. This is people first generate political authority in becoming a political society and then give that authority to rulers. So we can have a political society without government in that first step. Government is just that second step when we put in something specific above us. He says government must always rest on consent. He makes an interesting point. He says historically, pre-literate people often came together and became a political unit by mutual agreement. When they acquired government, authority by consent came into the world. So even if they didn't have anything written down, even though they had a government, they agreed on something, they put something into place. He says consent is tied to obligation. And with this, he distinguishes between express and tacit consent. He says tacit consent is even if we never swear allegiance to a government but accept its benefits without issue, we have given consent to the terms of their authority. So if we have the benefits of a society, we also have to follow their rules, to put it in simple words. But express consent is if we are asked for consent and given in proper form. If we swear allegiance to a government, that is express consent as opposed to tacit consent. But he does say that there are some complaints, some criticisms against these ideas of consent. The first is that consent is binding only when there is a fair choice of alternatives. So this idea of tacit consent, most of us cannot just get up and leave a country if we don't like this country's rules. Mm-hmm. So it's like, we don't have any alternatives. Is that actually consent? And the others is that, tacit consent is no consent at all. What can we do but accept the benefits of an orderly government? Is there any alternative? If we're in a society, how do we not accept the benefits of this society? Which is an interesting point. What do you think of those criticisms? Yeah, you don't know. All right. I think we've been talking for over an hour. I think you're getting
getting fatigued.
Fatigued. Yes, we only have a couple more sections. We'll get through it.
I made the mistake of going to the gym and running this morning before the podcast, and now I'm like, okay.
Yeah, we'll be very energetic.
Let's wrap it up.
Yes. Well, we're getting there.
Although I do like the revolution section.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that where we're headed next?
Yeah, we can get it.
I think that as government, the thoughts of government were summarized in that opening paragraph that you read.
Yeah, no, really absolutely. Did. Yeah. He goes on to say just a couple brief points. He's very casual about what exactly the forms of government are. Doesn't really care about, the different types of government. Correct. As long as, the people agree on it, then it's okay. Right. He also says the legislative function is the most important. He also separates legislative, executive, and federative. So similar to the separation of powers we have now, but he doesn't really go into checks and balances all that much. No. But that's a very brief summary there. Getting into revolution, he says a government possesses authority only within their constitutional bounds. If a government exceeds their bounds, it has declared war on its citizens, and its citizens therefore have a right to resist and reconstitute the government. So not just throw them out, but also to put in a whole new government in place, to modify the government, make it something new.
Yeah, I like this one quote that I've underlined.
I think I know exactly what it is.
And it's not from Locke, it's from the author, but
yes.
Summarizing Locke, I guess, or paraphrasing. Morally speaking, justified revolutions are defensive responses to the declaration of war by a corrupt ruling elite. And I have next to that is now. That is not
the quote I thought you were thinking of.
That's the quote I think is true. And it goes on. The familiar question is, who started it? It's always the government that starts it. It's always the government that starts the revolution, because people are generally going to be compliant. Generally going to be kind of like, okay, we're going to deal with it, kind of like we all did with COVID. But at some point, the government is going to get so completely out of control that they have started a revolution, and the only possible alternative is to throw them out and replace them with something else.
Yeah, that is not the quote I thought you were going to say.
What is the quote you thought I was going to say?
We can only appeal to heaven with swords in our hands.
Oh,
I like that.
Yeah. That's how we do it.
Yes. That's, because he's saying, kind of the argument against, well, they have this divine right, they were anointed, blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, who has the authority here? How do we appeal to guys? Well, there's no way for us to do that unless we actually take up arms.
Right. We have to do something about it. You can't just pray about it.
Yeah. He says, whatever ceremonies attended a coronation are besides the point. Kings who attack their subjects are criminals, and that's that.
That is that.
Yes.
That is correct. If they attack us, they are criminals, period. Whether you say, well, they acted lawfully, no. If they attack our freedom, even if they pass a law saying they can attack our freedom, they're still criminals.
Yeah. Absolutely. He then goes in.
Up again.
I could tell. We're getting energetic.
Yes.
He attacks William Barclay, who is a defender of absolutism and divine right. He has a great quote here. He says, Barclay says that people may resist, but with reverence, kind of going against, it can't be a violent revolution.
Yeah, my ass.
And Locke,
pardon my language.
Locke uncharacteristically allows him an extended paragraph of mockery, culminating with the observation, he that can reconcile blows with reverence may, for aught I know, look to receive a civil, respectful cudgeling wherever he may find it.
That is a good quote.
Which is great. It's amazing. Yes.
Respectful.
He says those who resist must be ready to use force, because force will certainly be used against them.
Yep.
You can't expect, well, I'm going to do this peacefully, I'm going to resist. They're going to, get cut down on your revolution.
And that's why I think revolution is really the last resort of the people, because if like the Americans, they knew that if they lost that war, they'd all be hung. They'd all be killed. All their property taken from them, their kids basically sold into slavery. I think, it would not be, or at least servitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and so if you're at that point, it's going to be violent, and that's just the nature of it.
Yeah. He also says, like, the two-step process of the social contract is very important here, as I outlined earlier. First we create a political society, and then we create a government. He says the political community could evict the government it had installed and install another without threatening the identity of the underlying political community. So you don't have to get rid of all your virtues, all your values, everything you hold dear to yourself to throw out this government. Correct. Those still exist. We are still a political community. We've just thrown out whatever thing we put in place above us, and we can put in a new one.
And I like this quote from the author of this book. The end of that section. The idea that we can evict our rulers without undermining the common understanding that not only make us one people, but make us governable was one of the most important ingredients of American radicalism. So that's true in the American Revolution, is that they're saying we're not going to change society. We're just going to change the government and how we all decide how we're to rule ourselves.
Yes.
And I think that's still true today. I think if there's going to be a revolution, a successful revolution, it has to keep that in mind. And we don't have to overthrow this current system and just throw everything out and have a new society. You keep the general understanding of a Republican form of government, a federal government. You just have to reform and basically throw out almost everybody we have in Washington. And reform the system where we select those people in the future, and limiting their authority over us.
Exactly. He says stability was still very important to Locke. Kind of, draws a contrast between him and Jefferson later, who kind of advocated for a revolution every 30 years.
Every 30 years.
But
keep us focused.
Yeah. But Locke said that revisiting the system of representation as infrequently as once a century would be enough. Yeah. You don't need to do this, every 30 years.
Well, Jefferson said a lot of stupid things, too. Definitely, he was a brilliant guy, but he said a lot of stupid. That was one of them.
Yeah. And he kind of summarizes by saying revolution is a measured, controlled, but violent act that disposes of a tyrannical government without destroying the bonds of everyday life. That is what a revolution should be.
Yep.
We then get into the last section on toleration, another big part of Locke's ideas. He says, kind of what I said earlier, but Locke originally believed in the crown's right to establish forms of worship, but later believed heavily in toleration. And he kind of believed that there was a twofold society, that of this world and that of the other. And with that, he very much separates church and state. They have no right to say anything about each other due to a certain extent, and that the only, essentially the only authority that the state has over religious things is the same authority that it has over any other institution, any other, group of people. He says the world is divided between two forms of authority, neither of which have any reason to interfere with the other. But he does say that the state will still protect the earthly interests of the church as a corporate body, and restrictions apply to worship according to the law. He says, one who burns a church is still guilty of arson. It's not like the state can't say anything about religion, about the protection of religion. And he also says that infant sacrifice would not be tolerated. In a place where infant sacrifice is against the law, you cannot just claim religious, rights there.
Yes.
Which is actually weirdly applicable. I've seen the Church of Satan, big people in the United States right now. I've seen, rumors or claims that the Church of Satan should say that abortion is part of their religious freedoms in states where abortion is banned, and therefore they should be allowed to have access to it. Locke would not agree to that. Of course, if it's against the law, you can't just do that as part of your forms of worship.
Well, I think that there's a lot of overlap between Satanists and abortionists. Don't you
yes,
think?
I think so.
They call themselves atheists, but they're really Satanists. Yes. They really desire the evil things in this world.
Now, the Church of Satan is also an interesting group. They claim that they don't actually believe in Satan, of course. They're just, that's what they say. We're just using Satan as a name, but I think...
I believe that they may be fibbing.
Yes.
But I don't think that their religion would prohibit that.
That's true. They have no moral obligation to tell the truth.
I think that I would expect them to be dishonest about their beliefs. Don't you think?
Probably. Probably.
I don't know how I would rule as a judge about a claim for religious exemptions by the Satanists to perform abortions as part of their religious. It just seems like it's just so perfect. It is really a synopsis of what it really is. It's such a anti-moral, anti-human activity.
You would codify into law that abortion is part of a Satanist ritual.
I think that we should just, there should be a declaration made by the next president, the next Republican president, that all abortions, just a resolution, nothing binding.
Yes.
All abortions are a form of Satan worship. Just come out and say it.
That'd be great. He also says that atheists are beyond toleration, kind of what we mentioned earlier. They have no reason to keep their promises or accept the premises of morality on which society depends. Right. He's also not very tolerant of Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
He says the Roman Catholic Church also acts as a secular state allied to other secular states, and a good Catholic would therefore have divided loyalties. And so therefore, subscribing to a religion that requires us to betray our country makes us a traitor. Of course, very much tied to his own experiences with the English king actually giving up his country to essentially a Catholic state.
Well, and it was a different Catholic church then, too.
Mm-hmm.
It actually had a lot of secular power that it doesn't assert or have now, except for in the Vatican.
Yeah, I don't think he
all
would...
things go in the Vatican.
I think he would still be very, very critical of the Catholic Church, but I don't think Locke would have this same very much aggression towards Roman Catholics at this point.
Right,
yes.
right. I think this particular criticism doesn't ring true today because there's not a divided loyalty.
Yeah.
Because the Catholic Church is out of the state business
for the most part.
Yeah. Well, where isn't it?
But to kind of summarize, just to wrap everything up, he says, Locke's arguments for limited and constitutional government, economic freedom, and religious liberty can be read as if they were made yesterday. That's kind of how Alan Ryan ends this.
Very fresh.
Very much,
his stuff is really good. I really enjoy studying Locke.
Yeah, no, he's great. He's a great author. What do you think overall of this chapter?
Very good.
I think
he's really the foundation of the American Republic. I think in a lot of ways. Yeah, and they were just but I think there's a little bit of Hobbes in them because they wanted to. There's a distrust of government, although Hobbes didn't have that because Hobbes had really, when you talk about the government, Hobbes believed that
they have
complete
absolute
total authority and absolute authority over you. So, but I think the sense that we're all sinners and if we give power to people. They almost believed Machiavelli, It's like, but in the reverse, it's like we got to keep these. Everybody's a Machiavellian acolyte once they get power. Yeah, and I think that sensibility about the separation of powers and the checks and balances and all that is really, I think, the foundation. Getting to my conclusion, the foundation is Locke. We have natural rights, and it's the government's responsibility to protect those rights, and then they set up a structure to try to guarantee that those protections were in the Constitution and that the government would be enfeebled in its ability to try to impose itself upon you.
I mean, Locke's just a fantastic, I think, political theorist. Yeah. I think if I disagree with him anywhere in anything we talked about in this chapter, it's slightly on his idea of human nature.
Well, there's also the slavery.
Yes, I forgot about the slavery.
The anti-Catholic bigotry.
And the anti-Catholic.
Those
minor things. But I think everything else, he sets up just such a consistent, I think, view of the government. I think a lot of what helps him there is because he used to see it from the complete opposite side. Right. Because he's used to think, well, absolute authority, everything, that's all great. And then he saw where absolute authority leads. And he's like, we can't do that. That's terrible. That's awful.
He has the convert's passion.
Yes, exactly.
Understanding of a belief system.
But yes, fantastic political theorist. Maybe one of my favorites.
So far.
I don't know if we'll get any better than this.
Really?
I'll be honest.
What else do we have?
I mean, we have the American Revolution, but I think once we get into a lot of the more modern people, it gets, well, we're going to be talking about communism and socialism a lot, I'm sure.
Yeah, we got Marx ahead, don't we?
Yeah, we have Marx ahead. Let's see. Yeah, so we'll be going into republicanism, which will be interesting. Rousseau, interesting character. American founding, French Revolution, Hegel, utilitarianism.
John Stuart Mill.
Karl Marx, yeah. And then we'll get into part 2 of this whole, second book is the world after Marx. So looking at, how empires and socialism and communism spread and things like that. It'll be interesting going forward. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No.
All right. Well,
do you?
Well, you can, of course. Check out the rules for our t-shirt giveaway competition on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. Make sure to leave a very interesting review, and you'll be entered into a competition to win a free no expense to you, of course, T-shirt with Joseph Campbell's face on the back of it. It's a pretty good T-shirt.
Yeah.
I pat myself on the back for that one.
Good design.
Yes. All right. Well, I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
This has been Unlimited Opinions.
Good night.
Yeah. Hour 25 right now, just about.
Jeez, that was a long one.